It was a bitterly cold January morning in 2019 when the quiet rhythm of Maple Street was broken by an unusual disturbance. 6 unmarked police vehicles rolled silently to a stop in front of a modest 2-story home in Huntington, West Virginia. The air was still, heavy with frost. Curtains stirred as curious neighbors peered through narrow slits, their breath fogging the glass. Officers in tactical gear fanned out, surrounding the property with practiced precision. Inside, 78-year-old David Kowalski moved through his morning ritual, the same one he had performed for nearly 5 decades. The slow grind of coffee beans, the familiar hiss of the kettle, the quiet hum of a radio murmuring local news. To everyone who knew him, he was a model citizen, a retired high school chemistry teacher, a community volunteer, a beloved grandfather of 4. But at 7:32 a.m., a sharp knock shattered that illusion. "David Kowalski," a voice announced through the door. "West Virginia State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1971 murder of Catherine Fitzgerald." The sound of those words seemed to freeze the air. Later, officers would recall how his hand trembled slightly as he set down the coffee mug, but his face, calm, almost serene, betrayed something chilling. The look of a man who had been expecting this moment for half a century. Cut to March 16, 1971. Morning light spills across the Marshall University satellite campus in Cabell County. 22-year-old Catherine Fitzgerald, a bright pre-med student, doesn't show up for her usual Tuesday breakfast with her friend, Patricia Wilson. By mid-morning, Patricia's concern turns to panic. Campus security unlocks Catherine's dorm room, and the world tilts. There, on the dorm room floor, lies Catherine, strangled with her own scarf. Her textbooks are still open on the desk. A cup of coffee sits half full, its surface cooling to a dull film. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just the silent aftermath of sudden violence. For 50 years, the man who took her life walked freely, not hiding in shadows, but smiling in the sunlight of small-town respectability. He attended fundraisers where Catherine's grieving parents spoke about justice. He shook the hands of detectives who once questioned him and then cleared him. He coached Little League, served on the school board, and in 1997 was named Citizen of the Year. Every Christmas, he mailed cards to the very officers who had once suspected him. And all the while, the truth slept inside an evidence box, a whisper preserved beneath Catherine's fingernails. Half a century later, that whisper would finally speak. How did a supposed pillar of the community evade justice for nearly 50 years? What trail, invisible to the naked eye, finally led investigators to his doorstep after thousands of dead ends? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how many lives brushed against a killer who wore the perfect mask of normalcy? Before we uncover the forensic breakthrough that ended West Virginia's longest unsolved murder, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel brings you the most haunting true crime stories, the ones that linger, that twist ordinary lives into something unforgettable. Because sometimes, the most dangerous monsters aren't hiding in the dark. They're the ones who mow their lawns, wave to their neighbors, and smile as they pass you on Maple Street. Catherine Fitzgerald was born June 12, 1948, in Charleston, West Virginia, the eldest of 3 to Elizabeth and Michael Fitzgerald. Her father worked as a civil engineer for the State Highway Department. Her mother taught piano out of their small house on Kanawha Boulevard. From early on, Catherine stood out, not for showy brilliance, but for the quiet, steady kind. She fixed leaky faucets with the same focus she brought to science fair projects. She was the older sister who didn't hand you answers. She guided you to find them yourself. She believed in people's potential, her sister Margaret would say years later, and she lived like it was her job to prove it. At a time when many young women were steered toward teaching, nursing, or homemaking, Catherine's gaze never wavered: medicine. Her high school yearbook caption read, "Plans to attend Marshall University and become a doctor." It wasn't a small dream for a working-class girl in late 1960s West Virginia. It was a declaration. She graduated Charleston High in 1967 and became the first in her family to attend college, starting at Marshall's main campus in Huntington, before transferring to the smaller satellite campus in Cabell County for pre-med. drawn by the closer student-to-faculty ratio and extra office hour time. By 1971, Catherine had found her rhythm. Professors praised her in organic chemistry and biology. The librarian noted her tidy margin notes and the way she reshelved a reference book with both hands, like it could bruise. She lived in Sycamore Hall, a women's dorm with about 80 residents. Mid-semester, her roommate withdrew, leaving Catherine a rare luxury, a room to herself. She kept it orderly, index cards rubber-banded by topic, a small chemistry problem set inked in neat blue lines, a spiral notebook open on the desk beside a chipped mug that smelled faintly of instant coffee. She worked part-time at the library, attended pre-med society meetings, and volunteered weekly at Cabell County Hospital, where she learned that being helpful often meant being quiet and present. March 15, 1971, Monday, looked ordinary on paper. She went to comparative anatomy at 8:30 a.m., advanced chemistry at 11. Lunch at 1:15 with her friend Patricia Wilson in the campus cafeteria. Enzyme kinetics, exam strategy, the usual half-teasing about Catherine's habit of overstudying her way into the top score anyway. From 2:30 to 5, she worked the library desk, reorganizing medical journals and tracking down obscure articles for a professor who always misplaced his citations. At 5:30, security footage captured her moving through the dining hall with a tray and a pocket notebook, eating alone while reviewing notes. She checked out 2 books at 7:15 and returned to Sycamore Hall. Her last diary entry, scribbled close to midnight, read like a small contract with herself. Tired, but accomplished. Finish chem problem set before Wilson's class. Mail dad's card tomorrow. Summer internship application due Friday. Review once more. It is a cruel thing that a life can be summed by what's left on a desk. A mug's cooling ring, a half-solved equation, a note to remember a father's birthday. The power of Catherine's story isn't the sensational, the flashing lights, the sealed evidence bags. It's the ordinary, because that's what she lost. A Tuesday breakfast, a stack of flashcards, a plan to take the 4:10 bus home that weekend. It's the familiar in her habits that makes the absence feel larger. Her careful lists, her library shifts, the ritual Monday night call to her parents. Between those routines and the horror that followed lay roughly 9 hours. In that gap, the case found its center of gravity, a mystery that would hold for decades. Friends and faculty would recall her focus and her kindness. Investigators would return, again and again, to the room that looked almost undisturbed. The second coffee cup on the desk, the key later discovered in her pocket, the notebook left open to an underlined line, enzyme regulation. For our purposes, the night resolves into 5 points of reference, 5 small coordinates to anchor everything that came after. 7:15 p.m. Catherine checks out 2 library books and heads back towards Sycamore Hall. 8:50 p.m., she's seen returning to her room. A hallmate trades a brief hello in the corridor. 9:20 p.m., Catherine calls her parents, the standing Monday ritual. She sounds happy, making plans for her father's birthday. 11:05 p.m., a neighbor across the hall reports faint, muffled voices from Catherine's room. Not arguing, just conversation. 9:15 a.m., March 16, Catherine is discovered on the floor of her dorm room. The coffee on the desk is no longer warm. What remains is the ache of the unfinished, a future folded shut in a spiral notebook, a coffee cup that never reached the sink, a life that should have stretched far beyond one ordinary Monday. The investigation hardened quickly around 2 small objects on a tidy desk, 2 coffee cups. They were the first paradox of the case and the first lesson. One bore Catherine's prints, the other was wiped clean, deliberately, carefully, as if the visitor had arrived with a plan. 2 cups meant consent or familiarity, someone she trusted enough to let in late. A wiped rim meant forethought, someone who knew what fingerprints could say. Together, they told a story of trust breached by calculation. Witness accounts anchored a compressed timeline. Multiple students saw Catherine studying in the dorm common room that evening. 8:50 p.m., a hallmate saw her return to her room and exchange a brief hello. 9:20 p.m., the weekly Monday call to her parents, confirmed by phone records. She sounded bright, making plans for her father's birthday. 10:15, 10:20 p.m. A neighbor heard the high, thin whistle of a kettle from inside Catherine's room. 11:05 p.m. The same neighbor reported muffled voices, not an argument, just conversation. Between 11:45 p.m. and 2:30 a.m., the medical examiner's window for time of death. 9:15 a.m., Catherine was found. From the start, detectives hit a wall of logistics and appearances. Sycamore Hall had strict rules. Visitors signed in and left by 10. The March 15th sign-in ledger showed no one for Catherine. The night guard swore no unauthorized entry after hours. If the cup said someone was there, the paperwork said no one was, which left three unsettling possibilities. The killer was another resident, the killer was a university employee with access, or the killer slipped through security by exploiting a seam, shift change, routine blindness, a held-open door. The second object that mattered wasn't a thing, so much as a trace. Under Catherine's right-hand fingernails, the crime lab recovered microscopic flecks of skin. To the 1971 team, it was a fragile note addressed to the future, a seed of DNA long before DNA was anyone's everyday language. They bagged it, labeled it, and promised to keep it safe. They could not yet read it, but they could refuse to lose it. Detective Frank Mullins built concentric circles of suspicion, those closest to Catherine's daily life, those who crossed paths routinely, and those who might have encountered her by chance. 47 interviews in the first days, friends, professors, dorm residents, staff. 23 sets of fingerprints, 15 hair samples. A boyfriend with a possessive streak, Thomas Mitchell, was grilled 3 times, his alibi held, corroborated by classmates and a dorm phone call at 11:30 p.m. A maintenance worker, Raymond Lewis, looked promising until hospital records placed him in a bed with a broken ankle at 9:45 p.m. the night of the murder. A professor, William Harris, whose attention veered close to inappropriate, volunteered prints and passed an alibi check. One by one, the obvious names fell away. Meanwhile, the evidence behaved like the era it lived in, stubbornly analog. The scarf yielded no hair or fibers that could be matched with 1970s tools. Powder dusting on the cups produced exactly what the story already implied: Catherine's prints on her mug and a too-clean twin beside it. The second cup remained the case's most eloquent silence. By week's end, Sheriff Thomas Hayward's notes turned grim. This was not random, he wrote. Someone targeted her. Someone comfortable enough to share a late coffee, meticulous enough to wipe prints, and knowledgeable enough to move unnoticed. When Catherine's body was released to her family, the squad was left chasing shadows. The funeral in Charleston drew more than 400 mourners, classmates, faculty, neighbors. The university president praised her promise. Her father, composed through the service, broke only as the casket lowered. Outside, Elizabeth Fitzgerald faced cameras with a mother's steel. Someone out there knows. Please, speak. Back on campus, fear thickened into routine. Parents pulled daughters from the satellite campus. Girls walked in pairs under newly installed floodlights. Patrols doubled. And as the weeks passed, fear hardened into something flatter. Numbness. Headlines shrank. The phones rang less. What remained was a family's helplessness and a town's uneasy adjustment to a new rule. Danger could look like anyone. Still, the detectives worked. Mullins expanded outward, adding 43 more names from Catherine's off-campus orbit. Clerks, bus drivers, hospital patients who remembered her gentle voice. A vague tip surfaced in June. An elderly woman across from Sycamore Hall had glimpsed a man climbing from a window around 1 a.m. Average height, dark clothing, nothing you could pin a badge on. The sighting fit the medical window, but it lacked a face. Technology, too, lacked a face. The lab preserved what it could, how it could. Paper bags instead of plastic, handwritten chain of custody forms, shelving that wasn't climate controlled. Every procedure carried risk of degradation. Mullins compensated with obsession. He personally oversaw how Catherine's evidence was packaged, repackaged, and stored. He could not make time move faster, but he could make it safer for the day science would. By late April, the first list of 27 suspects was exhausted. By September, 6 months in, the case was formally open but inactive, the bureaucratic phrase for a door that is not locked but rarely opens. The ledger of effort was long. 124 leads, 201 interviews, 97 pieces of physical evidence. Each new hypothesis collapsed under the same weight. No witness, no motive, no clean link that could stand in a 1971 courtroom. And yet, Two small anchors held the file to the future, a clean cup that screamed intention, and a pinch of skin, caught by a young woman's last act of resistance, saved by a detective's stubborn care. In a community drifting from terror to tiredness, those traces became the family's thin line of faith. They could not know when. They could only believe science would one day speak, that the second cup's silence and the whisper beneath Catherine's nails would eventually pronounce a name. When Sheriff Thomas Hayward sat across from the Fitzgeralds to tell them the case for their daughter was being classified as open but inactive, he later said it was the hardest conversation of his career. Michael Fitzgerald stared with emptied eyes. Elizabeth gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. They didn't cry or rage. They simply nodded, as if they had been bracing for this moment all along. Then they made one request: preserve everything. Every scrap, every swab, every note. Hayward gave his personal word, a promise that would one day connect 1971 to 2019 through a chain of carefully kept evidence boxes, time capsules waiting for science to speak on behalf of a silenced victim. While the boxes slept, the killer did not. He was busy living two lives. Then, a 30-year-old high school chemistry teacher, tidy, patient, with a knack for breaking down complex ideas and a reputation for staying late to help students who were struggling. Later, a pillar of the community, church committees, youth sports, city council, a dependable face at memorials and fundraisers. He knew the Fitzgeralds by name, offered condolences with practiced warmth, stood just close enough to grief to borrow its credibility. How does someone do that? The answer isn't one pathology, but a set of interlocking gears, each turning the mask until it looks like a face. Moral licensing, good deeds as camouflage. He gave time, money, and attention, racking up receipts of public goodness. That generosity didn't wash the crime away, but it laundered reputation. The mind loves balance sheets. If a person does so much visible good, we instinctively round down their capacity for harm. He understood that reflex and fed it. One volunteer shift, one scholarship check, one warm handshake at a vigil at a time. Impression management. Standing near pain to control the story. He didn't run from the aftermath. He inserted himself into it. The man who attends memorials, who quotes safety protocols, who holds the microphone just long enough to look useful, becomes part of the narrative scaffolding. Proximity reads as concern. Concern reads as innocence. If you stand close enough to the wound, people forget to ask if you held the knife. Power over narrative, the souvenir and the headline. For men like this, control is a flavor they never stop craving. They revisit clippings, monitor anniversaries, tuck away tokens, objects no larger than a memory that let them replay the moment of dominance in private. Each article is a mirror. Each unsolved headline is a quiet applause only they can hear. The performance continues, long after the curtain should have fallen. Compartmentalization, walls within walls. He built a house inside himself, one room for the public man, devoted teacher, faithful congregant, reliable neighbor. Another room, windowless, locked from the inside where the truth lived. In that room, he filed away the facts, the risk calculations, the small rituals of hiding. He didn't have to believe he was good. He only had to believe he could keep the rooms from touching. The halo effect, why communities get fooled. We're wired to let a single positive trait throw a glow over everything else. Academic title must be safe. Civic award must be kind. We outsource vigilance to image. It's not stupidity, it's human economy, the brain's way of conserving energy in a crowded world. He exploited that economy ruthlessly. Degrees and deference became armor. The well-lit life became cover for the unlit act. Set against these mechanics' deception are the slow mechanics of grief. After the funeral, the Fitzgerald home in Charleston filled with casseroles and sympathy cards and a suffocating weight of unanswered questions. Elizabeth, once a lively piano teacher with 27 students, stopped teaching. Michael took a 6-month leave from the highway department and returned smaller, quieter, the outline of a man. The first year was survival, Margaret, Catherine's younger sister, would recall years later. Her mother would set the dinner table for 4 and go still. Her father would begin a sentence. When Kathy comes home for Christmas, then dissolve into silence. The house was not haunted by Catherine's ghost so much as by her absence. Out of that absence, the family built purpose. When the investigation was suspended that September, Michael began filling leather-bound journals, documenting every call with law enforcement, clipping every article, logging each rumor that blew across Cabell County. 17 volumes by the time he died in 1994, a father's audit of a world that had failed his daughter. Elizabeth turned outward. In 1973, she founded West Virginia Families for Justice, a small living room gathering that swelled to 300 members by the 1990s. They lobbied for evidence preservation laws, longer statutes, and cold case funding. "The man who took my daughter stole more than her life," she told lawmakers in 1978. "He stole our peace, our trust in the world, our sense of order, but he will not steal our determination." Margaret was 16 when Catherine was killed. She rewrote her future, traded literature for law, graduated from West Virginia University in 1980, and became a prosecutor, barred ethically from touching her sister's case, but relentless for other families. "I couldn't save Catherine," she would say, "but I can keep other families from feeling as helpless as we did." And every March 16th, Detective Frank Mullins returned to the evidence, laying files across a conference table like a vigil, not because he expected a sudden miracle, but because ritual is resistance to forgetting. He repackaged and relabeled when new protocols arrived. He walked boxes to higher shelves during a flood. He was not speeding time, but he was buying it, for the day science might finally catch up. Here is the ethical lesson that sits in the hollow between those boxes and the smiling photographs. Good people and good deeds do not equal harmlessness. Warmth does not equal safety. A pleasant manner, a credible title, a well-timed donation, none of these immunize a soul against darkness. Communities conflate charm with character because it's expedient. Predators count on it because it works. So the question turns back on us. What do we choose to trust? Appearances, systems, or the quiet testimony of evidence? The Fitzgeralds chose the last. They staked their hope on a seed of skin under a young woman's nails and a sheriff's promise to keep it alive. They believed stubbornly that one day the second coffee cup's silence would be broken, and the whisper trapped beneath Catherine's right hand would finally name the man who had lived, for so long, 2 careful lives. They called it the voice of time. For nearly 5 decades it lay dormant, microscopic flecks of skin trapped beneath Catherine Fitzgerald's fingernails, sealed inside an aging evidence envelope. It couldn't scream, couldn't testify, couldn't point a finger. But it waited, intact, for the day science would finally learn to listen. That day came in 2019, the whisper that became a name. By then, the field of forensic genealogy had transformed cold cases into living histories. The idea was disarmingly simple. If a killer's DNA didn't match anyone in the criminal database, maybe it would match a cousin. Scientists could trace the branches backward, one relative at a time, until the tree led home. No magic, no miracle. Just the arithmetic of heredity, the biology of belonging turned into an instrument of justice. When the Cabell County Cold Case Unit reopened the Fitzgerald file, they started with almost nothing. Paper bags yellowed at the edges, half-faded labels, and those few milligrams of preserved tissue. A forensic technician wearing nitrile gloves opened the package under a sterile hood and whispered, "Please hold together." Against all odds, it did. The sample yielded a partial DNA profile, incomplete but enough to feed into a national genealogy database. A few weeks later, a ping appeared. Not a suspect, but a third cousin in Pennsylvania. From there, detectives followed bloodlines like roads on an old map, cross-checking marriage licenses, obituaries, birth records, until the name David Kowalski surfaced, a retired chemistry teacher, living just miles from where Catherine had died. The coffee cup in the trash, even the strongest hunch demands proof. In February 2019, investigators set up quiet surveillance outside Kowalski's Huntington home. They watched as the elderly man went about his morning rituals, grocery runs, afternoon walks, picking up mail at the post office. One afternoon, he stopped for coffee at a gas station and tossed the paper cup into a public trash bin. Minutes later, detectives retrieved it using sterile gloves and sealed it in evidence tape. The test results came back days later. The DNA on that cup matched the genetic material from beneath Catherine Fitzgerald's fingernails. 50 years collapsed into a single result. The moment of reckoning. When the officers arrived that January morning, Kowalski didn't resist. He didn't ask who had accused him. He didn't demand a lawyer. He simply nodded as they read him his rights. "It's about Catherine, isn't it?" he said quietly. In the interrogation room, faced with the DNA report, he stared at it for a long time, tracing the printed numbers with his fingertip as if reading a foreign language. Then he whispered the words that finally ended half a century of silence. "I always wondered when you'd find me." No drama, no tears, just a sentence drained of everything but fact. Justice arrives late, but it arrives mime. The arrest shook Huntington and all of Cabell County. To neighbors, he was the kind of man who shoveled driveways for free, organized bake sales, wrote letters to the editor about civic pride. The idea that he could strangle a 22-year-old girl, attend her funeral, and live among her grieving family for decades felt impossible. But the science didn't care about disbelief. Molecules don't lie, even when memories do. In court, the Fitzgerald family sat together in the front row. Elizabeth, now frail and white-haired, clutched her daughter Margaret's hand as the charges were read. Margaret, by then a seasoned prosecutor herself, had once vowed that science would someday speak for Catherine. It finally had. During the plea hearing, when asked if he wished to make a statement, Kowalski only said, "There's nothing to say that will change it." The room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to hum. 50 years too late, but justice had caught up. The voice of time. For the Fitzgeralds, justice was not vengeance, it was recognition. Proof that memory, when preserved with enough care, could outlast deceit. The fragment of skin beneath Catherine's nails had done what no human witness could. It testified across generations. Science had become the language of ghosts, the patient, impartial scribe of truth. And in that language, Catherine finally spoke. Her whisper, saved by a detective's caution and a family's faith, became the echo that ended two lives at once. The young woman's unresolved story and the old man's long illusion of escape. As Sheriff Hayward had once promised, the evidence box had waited, bridging 1971 to 2019. Inside it, a single truth endured. The smallest thing, properly kept, can outlive the loudest lie. When the verdict came, it didn't sound like triumph. It was quiet, like a stone dropped into deep water. In Huntington, the community that had once trusted without question began to look at itself differently. The revelation that a beloved teacher, volunteer, and neighbor had lived among them for 50 years with a murderer's secret left a hairline fracture in collective faith. People who had once greeted each other with unthinking warmth now paused, measuring their words. The town didn't stop being kind, it simply learned to verify kindness. At Marshall University, the shock was equally profound. Catherine Fitzgerald's name, long tucked into dusty archives, was brought back into the light. The university quietly removed David Kowalski's plaques from its alumni hall and scrubbed his name from the faculty honors board. In their place, they established the Catherine A. Fitzgerald Memorial Scholarship, awarded each year to a woman pursuing medicine or forensic science. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about reclaiming memory, turning a space once shadowed by deceit into a tribute to perseverance and truth. In a ceremony held at the small campus where Catherine had studied, Margaret Fitzgerald spoke before a crowd of students who weren't yet born when her sister died. Her voice trembled only once when she said, "The lesson isn't that monsters hide among us. The lesson is that goodness must be proven every day, through honesty, through accountability, through the courage to look twice when something doesn't fit." The room was silent, except for the faint sound of her mother's hands clasping in her lap. The half-weight of justice. For the Fitzgerald family, the conviction was not closure. It was relief without release. Half the weight lifted, half remained. Justice could name the killer, but it couldn't rewind birthdays, graduations, or decades of wondering. Elizabeth, in her final interview before her passing, put it simply, "We got the truth, but the truth doesn't fill a chair at the dinner table." Margaret carried that sentiment into her work, mentoring young prosecutors and reminding them that every evidence bag, every hair fiber, every timestamp could represent a life paused in place, waiting for someone to listen. The town that learned to remember Cabell County, once shaken by disbelief, began to rebuild its trust, not by forgetting, but by learning memory's discipline. Local police established a dedicated cold case unit, residents donated to fund improved evidence storage after hearing how fragile the Fitzgerald samples had been. High school students wrote essays about the voice of time, how science and persistence can outlast denial. Even the church that once hosted vigils for the unknown killer held a new one, this time celebrating the investigators who refused to let the case die. No one called it closure. They called it continuity, the sense that truth, however delayed, still travels faithfully toward daylight. The moral equation. If this story leaves a mark, it's not the shock of discovery, it's the quiet reckoning that follows. For half a century, a man used good deeds as a disguise, and a community let reputation stand in for character. His downfall reminds us that virtue performed for display can be as hollow as any lie. The halo can blind, the handshake can conceal, but it also proves something gentler and truer, that the smallest piece of honesty, a kept promise, a saved sample, a record unaltered, can outlast decades of deception. Goodwill does not exempt you from responsibility. Truth does not hurry, but it endures. Those words, now engraved on a bronze plaque beside Catherine's scholarship display, summarize what took 50 years to learn. Justice arrived too late for her to see it, but not too late for it to matter. And in that, perhaps, lies the quiet victory of everyone who still believes that time, though patient, always remembers. 50 years. One life stolen, one secret buried, one whisper that refused to fade. As the credits of time rolled forward, the story of Catherine Fitzgerald became more than a murder solved. It became a mirror. A mirror held up to every act of trust we offer, every face we believe, every silence we overlook. So now, the question turns to you. What do you believe in? Do you trust people, their words, their smiles, their histories? Do you trust the systems built to protect us, even when they fail for decades at a time? Or do you trust the quiet evidence, the traces that never lie, the fingerprints, the DNA, the fragments of truth that wait patiently beneath the noise? Because in the end, this case wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about the fragile balance between faith and proof, between what we hope is true and what time eventually confirms. It was about how a single act of violence can echo through generations, and how persistence, science, and conscience can still bring the echo to rest. If this story made you feel something, anger, sorrow, or even a flicker of hope, tell me what you think. In the comments, share your perspective. What do you trust more, human goodness, the system that seeks justice, or the silent evidence that never forgets? Your voice adds to the conversation that Catherine's story began. And if you want more deep dives into the psychology of crime, the hidden motives, the moral fractures, the minds behind the masks, hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and stay with us as we keep unearthing the truths that time tried to bury. Because here, every silence has a story, and every story, eventually, speaks.